So Games Workshop's next preview show is turning up on Friday. Deathcore Krieg reveals seem very likely, and there might be more besides. Let's talk possibilities for gas mask guardsmen, what's most likely, and what people would most like to see. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking Kriegsmen and the next Warhammer 40k reveal show, which at time of recording should be just around the corner later in the week. Games Workshop's next reveal show is going to be coming out on Friday. They'd already hinted that that would be the next time they had a major reveal show for their game systems, though they only formally announced it at the end of last week, giving us the date of Friday the 22nd November at 6 PM here in the UK, 1 PM Eastern Time over in North America, and other times as seen on screen here in other places around the world. The previous article gave us a few hints as to what things might be coming, though on their Sunday article they slightly expanded the list of things that they're going to have reveals for. It's going to be Warhammer 40k, Age of Sigmar, the Horus Heresy, the Old World, and also Black Library as well, which they hadn't confirmed before. So I guess the titles for a few new novels and things there, though it is also something that could come with the possibility of miniature reveals. They do seem to keep at least 40k stuff coming at least semi-commonly for them. This time the preview show is associated with the World Champions of Warhammer event, pretty much Games Workshop's flagship tournament of the year, the one where you need to have won a tournament somewhere around the world to get one of those golden tickets, and then everyone descends on Atlanta for a big high-stakes tournament with quite a lot of big names playing, and it'll certainly be interesting to see what comes out of that. They also have their Grand Narrative event running at the same time, which is supposed to have a little bit of official impact on one tiny corner of backstory 40k canon, and tournaments running for Age of Sigmar and Kill Team as well. Should be fun for those attending or following along with the events, though I feel like most people are probably most interested in the model reveals coming out for this one. And this time, just from the pattern of Games Workshop Codex reveals, I think we've got a solid guess as to what comes next, and it's quite likely to be a Krieg-themed reveal session unless they pull any big surprises on us. The reveal show is the final one of 2024, though they usually have some Christmas Day model reveals as well, plus a New Year's teaser session as well. And so far I think the only major hint that we've got as to the reveals that are going to be happening is that it's going to be centered around the rise and slaughter of humanity, which I guess maybe just means a bit more of a focus on human warriors as opposed to anything weird and Xenos perhaps. 2 preview shows ago, when Games Workshop announced the great big Codex gap, they confirmed that the first Codex of 2025 would be Astra Militarum, specifically stating that there will be a Deathcore Krieg release wave for them, and if anything it's kind of surprising that we haven't seen any model reveals from them yet. I feel like most of the time in Warhammer 40k we usually have a glimpse of the next model that's coming out, but not this time due to the big gap between Blood Angels and Astra Militarum. Beyond that, there's going to be an Aeldari release wave with Aspect Warriors, and then after that it's Imperial Knights apparently. Though I guess by that point we're getting a fair way into 2025 already, so that's probably going to be distant future at this point. In any case, my guess for these reveals is that it's probably going to focus around a Guard launch box, something similar to the Cadia Stands box but for Deathcore of Krieg, given that that's just the way that they do release waves these days. If you have a big model release, then it's a single launch box with the Codex in, and then other individual models to release after. I'm sure the Krieg release wave will have a fair few people excited. They're certainly a fan favourite regiment, originally introduced in a big way by Forge World with a bunch of expensive resin kits, basically Imperial Guard but World War I themed with plenty of gas masks, cavalry and artillery, and some kind of fun backstory, fighting a grueling centuries-long civil war to keep their planet loyal to the Imperium even if it reduced it to ashes in the process. Their soldiers are vat-grown and famously happy to lay down their lives for the Imperium. They've already had quite a lot of model representation with really quite a big Forge World army range, perhaps the single biggest standalone faction or near enough, the range gradually being eroded over the years with rules slowly being phased out and going to Legends. It means that Games Workshop do have a massive amount of things that they could draw on in deciding what they release for the Kriegsmen, and descriptions they used at the time were a division of new kits and a full Deathcore release, so that implies that when we do find out about them it's not likely just to be 1 or 2 miniatures, but hopefully a range refresh at least somewhat similar to what we got with the Cadians 2 years ago. This does come in the context of Forge World kits being retired and going to Legends, so in general, unless it's made into plastic, then it's going to probably lose miniature support, and the rules will go from Imperial Armour to Legends. Given they had so many options though, I thought it could be interesting to talk through which ones people are most keen to see, mainly focusing on units that Krieg either had in the past or do have currently that might be going to Legends, and throw in a few other Forge World things that are likely to be retired shortly as well. Before we jump into properly looking at Gas Mask Guardsmen, I'd just like to give a quick shout out to the video sponsor in Futureproof Modular Terrain. One option for getting terrain onto a 40k battlefield, who are launching really quite an interesting option on Kickstarter, expanding and improving upon their established brand of modular ruin terrain, where you can basically stack different bits like Lego in all sorts of different configurations, so you can have battlefield ruins that you can take to pieces and reassemble in a different way if it makes more sense to your gameplay. The biggest extra thing that they're expanding on for this Kickstarter is to have the pieces pre-painted by machines, with the option to have the pieces turn up in a whole bunch of different colours once they ship out. That does seem fairly impressive compared with other options out there, both having detailed terrain and not just flat pieces, and also pre-coloured so it can be put on the tabletop straight away. Here's a few examples of their colour schemes, though they do have some more that I'll take a look at the end of the video. Quite a few options to choose from here, things like sandbag style designs or blasted brickwork. But in any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check out their Kickstarter links down in the video description, and I'll cycle back towards the end of the video to talk a bit more in terms of pros, cons, and further details. In any case though, let's get back to the Death Korps, and just to gauge sort of sentiment for what people most wanted to see reimagined in plastic for them. I made a channel poll of 19 units that's rather Krieg specific, or units that they might well release alongside a Krieg one, just to see what was most or least popular. Voted lowest were this pair. Karis Venner was one of the Krieg special characters that I believe never had a mini but did have a 40k rule set. I believe he's dead in the lore though, so I guess that might make sense. And named characters might not be quite a top priority versus the more generic range, though I still think it perhaps wouldn't hurt to give them a figurehead character. Voted 18th was the Rapier Laser Destroyer, a fun little quad las cannon on tracks, maybe not necessarily Krieg related too much, but a long-standing option for the Astra Militarum that's often provided some good fire support, though it looks like its rules will be going to Legends fairly soon. Kind of interestingly, for one of the Death Korps' unique units that they did have miniatures for, there wasn't really that much love for the Quartermaster Cadre, who apparently act somewhere between a battlefield medic, administratum clerk, and a regimental preacher rolled into one for the Kriegsmen, helping keep their soldiers fit, supplied and motivated to be laying down their lives on the front line. I do remember that we had what looked like maybe a little bandage dispensing servo skull in the past, which I thought maybe could be something like a reinterpreted version of them, though I guess could be something like a medic in a command squad, or something else entirely perhaps. Voted kind of lower than I might have put it myself was the Hades breaching drill. I feel like these things always have a bit of fun factor, basically the idea of a great big mining vehicle that burrows away for a squad of guardsmen to make their way behind, and basically a team of sappers pop up behind enemy lines, basically kind of acting like a drop pod but for the Astra Militarum. Again, maybe not quite so specific to Krieg for that one, could be fun to pair with something like combat engineers though maybe. And perhaps a slightly similar related one is the Cyclops demolition vehicle, another bit of slightly weird and wonderful Guard Forge World tech, looking like an extremely miniature tank. It rolls around as a remote control bomb on tracks. Occasionally they've had some interesting rules over the years for being a fun little cheap annoying screening unit that can sometimes go off with a surprising bang. Otherwise, for vehicles maybe voted a little bit lower priority were the Krieg Storm Chimera and the Griffin or Colossus mortars. The Storm Chimera I believe wasn't too different from the regular variant, but packed an autocannon on the top of it for a little bit heavier firepower. I guess that could be the kind of thing they could add on to an upgrade sprue if they really wanted to, maybe in a similar way as they did with the Black Templar multi-melters, though it might be a little bit of an unlikely one. And otherwise the Griffin and Colossus both were in the Guard Codex once upon a time, but then got farmed out to Forge World, and the Griffin just went out of production entirely. I guess they're all a bit taken over by things like the Basilisk Wyvern, the Manticore and Field Ordnance batteries these days. For armoured vehicles, voted a little bit above these was the Centaur Armoured Carrier, which I feel like if Games Workshop were designing a Krieg range, this might have a bit more chance of getting made. A fairly small sort of artillery tractor type thing, used to pull Earthshaker or Medusa carriage batteries around. The front of the thing looking fairly similar to a Lehman Russ battle tank but on much smaller treads. If they wanted a light vehicle to release, this one feels like it could be a small project if they wanted to. Next up we've got the option of standard infantry squads. It looks like they'd have at least some popularity if they released these, given that they're retiring the Forge World versions of the Krieg infantrymen. I feel like this one maybe doesn't feel quite as massively desperately needed compared with if they didn't have the veteran guardsman kit that they do have. Using that one and the rules for it seem like they do the job kind of fine for representing Kriegsmen in game. It's not like you can't equip them with lasguns if you want to, and I think there's at least a fair chance they'll just stick with those veteran guardsmen as the way to represent Death Korps infantry. For the Kroot release though, they both got their Kill Team Farstalkers and Kroot Mercenaries as rank and file though. Kits that I thought were at least somewhat similar, so I guess that might set some precedent there, I don't really know. Just above them, in the next two places though, there's the other two unique variants of Krieg infantry, the combat engineers with their carcass shot shotguns, burrowing mole grenade launcher and gas bombs. They're a unit that maybe feels like they're a bit of a different special infantry squad to what Guard normally have at the moment. They were certainly quite popular with the rules that they had back in 8th and 9th edition at different stages. Though it seems that in the popular votes, the Grenadier Storm Squad, which are basically just stormtroopers but Death Corps, pips them to the post very slightly in this one. But I really don't know if we're very likely to see a fourth flavour of stormtroopers, where we've already got two different flavours of Scions plus the Kazakin as well. They definitely feel like a release they could justify if they want to, but I can't help but think the Games Workshop might go for something that's a little bit less overlapping with the roles of things like the Kazakin and the Scions. Next up, and another popular choice, was the Mars Alpha Lehman Russ. This was a Forge World made Krieg version of the regular Lehman Russ battle tank, sporting some different styling on the main body of the tank, a different pattern battle cannon, plus those trench crossing things that curve out behind it. I personally think that while this one looks like it's one that's definitely in demand, I think Games Workshop's less likely to do it. They really don't seem to have been a big fan of doing too many faction-specific vehicles these days for quite a long time. I feel like if you want something at least somewhat similar, you might be able to have some luck with the Solar Auxilia Lehman Russ battle tank. That one's got at least a few superficial similarities. Perhaps rated slightly higher than I expected on the poll numbers was a Death Corps Krieg upgrade sprue. Seems there's a bit more demand for that than I would have guessed. I certainly think that it's fairly likely to happen, given that we got the Cadian upgrade sprue that you can see here, with a bunch of fun helmets, spare parts like jerry cans and things, some sandbags, combat knives, and a tank commander. I guess it certainly wouldn't hurt to have some Death Corps bits to add to other things like, say, gunners and hatches of tanks and vehicles, or maybe to help mess around with certain more generic or more Cadian-looking Imperial Guardsmen from other kits, and help them fit the aesthetic of the regiment. It would be quite cool to see a Death Corps tank commander, and as mentioned, they could do something like an autocannon Storm Chimera variant if they wanted to via this. Definitely could be useful for people, I guess. I think my first instinct would have been to use spares and things from the Kill Team Veteran set though, more so than buy additional upgrade sprues, but it does look like it's in at least fair demand from this poll. Getting on to some of the most popular picks though, and next up we had Death Corps Krieg Heavy Weapons. This feels like something that Guard players would generally expect after a regiment release, I guess when we had all the metal regiments and things back in the past, plus the differences between the Cadian and Kazachan ones. The base things they got were infantry squads, heavy weapons and command squads each. The one that was released last year was very much a Cadian one, and they still have that Kazachan one on sale, though it is online only. I guess it could be possible they could add additional heavy weapon options. I believe Krieg had some heavy stopper options in the past. Could be a chance for them to get another option for gear there, though I can't imagine that being a particularly strong choice in a world without war gear points costs. Another thing that was voted particularly highly was a Death Rider character of some sort. They've got a datasheet for a squadron commander, and they had this commissar model as I believe a Games Day miniature in the past. As we'll get on to, Death Riders are one of the most anticipated things, and it will be good for them to have a leader riding those curious clawed steeds. Voted in 4th overall was some sort of field artillery. I guess something bigger than the bombast field gun that they've got at the moment on the Cadian field support batteries, as there's really quite a lot of those options that are going to be going to Legends otherwise, given that there's so many choices in the Forge World rules. I think the ones that people are most picturing are maybe the Earthshaker carriage or the Medusa, though I guess they could do things like the heavy mortar or the quad gun potentially. Out of these, I think my favourite pick out of the bunch of them would probably be the Medusa, given that we've already got at least one Earthshaker carriage as the Basilisk. I feel like sort of bunker-busting artillery is maybe a niche that the Guard don't have quite so specifically, even if they do have all manner of different indirect fire guns to choose from compared with most factions in 40k. Artillery does seem really quite appropriate for the Krieg though, given that it's basically their thing. We also had the rumour engine of this minefield marker, which feels like it could come from a bigger base or something. I could easily see that being on the base for a great big field ordnance gun of some sort. I feel like the launch of it might be kind of bittersweet in 10th edition though, given that Games Workshop seem to really quite want to keep indirect fire to be kind of niche due to its effect on game balance elsewhere. I can't help but think that if they release it for the Krieg, there's a good chance its rules wouldn't be all that powerful if it happens. Next up, and seen as one of the most necessary things by you guys, is a standard Death Corps Marshal. This guy's still a current HQ choice in Forge World, and something that people really quite often use alongside their Death Corps squads, giving them a feel no pain type save, and making some unusually durable Guard infantry in the midboard. Again, I guess this is probably going to be one of the safer bets out of the release wave. If they're going to go at least somewhat similar to the Cadians, then they had their Cadian Castellan miniature, so a Death Corps Marshal would feel like he'd be the equivalent of that. And I must admit, I did quite like the sculpt for the Forge World one. I don't think they'd have to change that much with his greatcoat. Just pips the post in second place. For things that are most anticipated though, there's the Death Riders of Krieg. As mentioned, they feel like they're perhaps the single most likely thing to get a Krieg release. They're the single best known Forge World unit for them, and all rather iconic with their disturbing gas mask mounts with clogged feet. They're one of Forge World's better selling models, having been kept around as an option, even going at their rather astronomical $33 per model, so I'm at $165 for a squad of 5 of them from Forge World before. The only slight weird thing to do for the Guard though is that it'd give them 2 fairly similar cavalry options between these and Attilan Rough Riders. I don't think anyone would be complaining too much given that the aesthetics are really quite different between them. Sort of semi-medieval cataphract steeds versus World War I cavalry formations perhaps, but it's just hard to imagine them doing a Death Corps release and not doing these in plastic. They could maybe do some sort of command section option for these, maybe similar to the Tempestus Scions. I wouldn't bank on that one though, it seems to be something they don't do quite as much these days. Say for example they dropped them for the Deathwing Terminator squad when they made them into Deathwing Knights. Finally, and voted the single most popular thing for the Death Corps was the regular command squad. I was maybe slightly surprised that they won the popular votes versus the Death Riders. I thought they would have been at the top. But again, like the heavy weapon squads, they feel like one of the staple units that Games Workshop should do if they're going to do each regiment properly with different ways to field them. And again, it's a mirror of the Cadian command squad and Kasachan command squad that they have already. It certainly looks like we're getting a command squad with a banner of some sort given a previous rumour engine. We had this one with a couple of bullet holes in it, I believe in the last Christmas Advent engine ones. This one was really quite specifically Imperial Guard and does bear some resemblance to the banner that you can see here. I'm guessing it's either going to be for a Death Corps command squad or maybe something similar like a Death Rider command squad perhaps. Overall, I feel like that maybe underlines the things that people most want to see for the Death Corps Krieg, barring any new units or surprises that Games Workshop throw our way. Perhaps the most likely things being things like heavy weapon squads and command squads, a new Marshal miniature, some field ordnance weapons, a new upgrade sprue, some Death Riders, and maybe either some combat engineers or Grenadier Storm squads if we get lucky. If they came out with at least a good chunk of that, that'd be already really quite a substantial release wave for them. Realistically, they're not going to do like 20 kits for one model release. That would just be above and beyond what Games Workshop normally do for any one faction release. I'm not sure what subset of them we might see on Friday, but my guess is that we'll see some but not all of the new Krieg releases. That tends to be their pattern with previews these days, show off the launch box in one big reveal show, and then drip feed out the further releases after that, perhaps the more supporting units like updates of sculpts or updated characters, often on Monday reveal shows after that. I suspect with the previews, if they do indeed do Krieg, we'll probably see just the content of this launch box, so maybe somewhere between 3 and 5 units out of the range, but probably not all of them and save more for later time unless they decide to go a bit more comprehensively. In any case, we'll certainly be fun to see what they come out with. I'll certainly cover it here on the channel as soon as I can. In general, I think my guess is that if they do a major Krieg release box reveal, we're unlikely to get too much else for Warhammer 40k. I think that should already be fairly good going for it compared with most reveal shows, but there's at least some chance they might be a bit generous and show off something else too. As we know by their roadmap, Aeldari are the next Codex after Astra Militarum, and we know that they're getting a release wave of Aspect Warriors for that, all sorts of hints with that. They gave language that very clearly hinted Swooping Hawks in their last previews, and we've already seen Phoenix Lord Fugan leak out, so Fire Dragons seem to be a shoe-in as well. And I guess a lot of this is just going to round out the bunch of kits they didn't release in 9th edition, when even then they had a fairly big release wave of like 10 kits or so. Even with that though, if they're following the normal 40k release wave pattern with box sets, if Kriegsmen are coming out in January, then Aeldari might be somewhere between February to April, and that just might be a little bit far out for seeing new stuff here. If we do though, there's certainly some models that are firmly in the crosshairs, Swooping Hawks, Fire Dragons and Warp Spiders, all of which are some of the oldest models in the game, particularly the Warp Spiders. And then out of the other characters, they've got the remaining Phoenix Lords, Baharoth, Karandras and Azaman. I've seen what looked like a leak of Azaman in the past, so maybe a bit more chance of him. I noticed one of Mr. Valrak's rumours was a Warp Spider Phoenix Lord as well, which would be kind of fun if true. There's also the question of what happens to Prince Irial as well. He's also a model that kind of needs an update as one of the last remaining Finecast models besides the Phoenix Lords. I'd be kind of surprised if Illic gets the same sort of treatment though. In any case, I'd be surprised if they go too heavy into Eldar, unless they surprise us with a big double bill of 40k launch boxes. Otherwise, the other intriguing possibility are Emperor's Children. I think in some ways there's a good chance they might actually be more likely to get content versus Aeldari, given that Games Workshop has already started teasing us with Emperor's Children things for a big release in 2025 sometime. And they've already had their launch teased and then a few renders of some shoulder pads shown off, the release having loads of parallels with what they did with World Eaters. For the World Eaters though, they decided to do a little bit of pre-hype by showing off One Corn Berserker early, just to give us a taste of what was coming for the faction. If they felt like it, they could certainly show off a Noise Marine if they wanted. I feel like that's been enough to generate a lot of excitement on its own, while still not really lifting the lid on the wider release. Again though, it maybe feels like a bit of an outside shot, and a full Krieg launch box release is likely to be the sole focus for 40k, unless they're being generous this time. Otherwise, beyond 40k, there's other game systems too, Age of Sigmar and Old World, though for relevance to the grim darkness of the far future, Horus Heresy certainly has occasionally interesting things for 40k purposes, and this one's got a bit more of a question mark as to where they go next with it. When they released those rather weird roadmaps, they said 2025 with something new every month, with tanks and more Legions Imperialis on the way. I guess if tanks are the only hint that we're being given, then maybe it could be something like a remake of the Legion Fellblade or similar. They certainly did go very heavy on redoing resin tanks into plastic ones for the Heresy setting. Otherwise, I guess at some point we can probably expect the other half of the Solar Auxilia and Mechanicum ranges, seeing as they basically half-released those, and they haven't really done too much Legion-specific stuff yet for the rebooted Heresy. The main focus seeming to be to get the main Legions into plastic first. For 40k purposes though, there's definitely a lot of interesting possibilities. I think plastic versions of the remaining Forge World Knights would certainly turn heads, the Atropos for the Cerastus class, the Knight Megara and Styrix for the Variant Questoris versions, and the Armiger Moirax with really quite a fun roster of weapons that it can field. All of those will be interesting, though I feel like it would be a lot nicer if Games Workshop did decide to include them in the Knights Codex, just so people would be less worried about them going to Legends as they did with the Space Marine Legends of the Heresy. In a similar vein, it seems kind of inevitable that the Adeptus Custodes are going to get a Horus Heresy release with their resin kits being made into plastic ones. They're another really quite popular Forge World range, perhaps in no small part due to the units having big points costs in game, so perhaps the resin doesn't feel quite as bad as it does for certain other armies. Plus being playable in both 40k and Heresy settings, it would be nice if the remaining Forge World resin got made into plastic, as it feels like they don't really have much of an army in 40k at the moment, at least outside of elite infantry and bikes. But again, it would be nice to come with the safety net that they'll definitely be supported in the 40k setting going forward. Otherwise for Heresy, I think everyone would quite like to see some new resculpted Primarchs. We've had Abaddon Ascended and Fulgrim Transfigured. They could certainly go through the rest of the roster of the traitor Primarchs to see what Chaos has been doing to them, or even just revisit some Loyalist ones and give them a second sculpt in the Heresy era setting if they wanted to. In general, they often tend to be crowd pleasers and have a lot of interest. Finally, it's probably just worth mentioning the Black Library reveals as well. This one they haven't confirmed any miniatures for them yet, so it could just be book titles and Games Workshop talking about them. Though often when they have reveal shows that feature Black Library, they might have a model reveal thrown in, just to add a bit of interest. No guarantees that it'll happen this time, but we've had some quite nicely received miniatures such as the Celestian Sacrosanct Avalyn here, Orc Warboss Oftak Blackheart, or Captain Messinius. Most of these went down okay. There's definitely no guarantees it's going to happen this time though, and even if it does, it could be for Sigmar or another setting. They keep the bulk of the miniature releases to 40k for Black Library, though it's not exclusive. In any case though, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If Krieg indeed does wind up being the theme of it, then what models would you most like to see from Games Workshop? And which ones do you most think that they'll deliver on? In any case, I'll certainly look forward to covering all the reveals here on Auspex Tactics on Friday. It'll be great to see what they come out with. That's the main video over, but for those interested, I'll cycle back to talk a little bit more about the video sponsor Futureproof Modular Terrain, made by Snot Goblin Gaming, and launching a Kickstarter at the moment for a painted version of their already very established ruined terrain pieces that can be assembled and disassembled like Lego blocks. Their Kickstarter's live until the 5th of December, and they currently have a bunch of early bird discounts live if you want to check them out. There'll be links down in the video description, and as mentioned, it's both a way that you can just get your hands on unpainted versions of their modular terrain, but also for them to develop their painted option for pre-painted terrain with durable pigments. The basic idea is that they're made of plastic components, really quite durable, and not too easy to damage compared with some. All their stuff is just made out of these 17 bits basically, and they can realise a whole bunch of different ruins, slotting in and out with those little tab things. On the checklist of things that you might want out of a functional terrain set, I feel like they do quite a lot pretty well. You can potentially disassemble them to store or transport them in a small space if desired. You can change layouts around, which you can't do with most things once assembled. It's nice to actually have some texture on the pieces, which is an advantage over things like MDF. If you do pay for the pre-painted version, then that's a selling point. Not really having to do any hobby work is quite nice, and to still be able to put pretty awesome looking terrain on the tabletop. It sounds like some of their previous pre-painted options had some downsides of the paint being able to scrape off a bit, but they're very much trying to specifically address that and make sure that doesn't happen this time around. Like most third-party terrain offerings, they're still cheaper than Games Workshop, and as gameplay goes, they could be used to ape certain competitive layouts if you wanted to, and they're fairly functional for playing 40k. Nice line of sight blocking ruins are helpful. For potential downsides, they are a little bit pricier than certain things like MDF, certain 3D printed offerings, or more basic and straightforward plastic stuff, particularly if going for the painted options. They're not aiming to be the cheapest, but be rather one of the best. It is being run with a Kickstarter, which always does come with some risks. If they have some problems with manufacturing or something, it might not be obvious until later on. Though admittedly they do have the back experience of their first one that they did that went ahead and was pretty popular and successful. And maybe I feel like while you could reconfigure terrain sets all the time, I still feel like that'd be a bit of effort, though I guess it's nice to have the option. In any case, their primary offering is this full table set. When I last checked, it was $240 or $300 painted, plus around about 15 to 30 shipping depending on where you live in the world. The painted set's approximately £240 or €290. As it goes, that could be worse for a full table worth of terrain, though obviously it isn't the very cheapest out there. Otherwise, they do have a half table set as well, which is basically half the components for near enough half the price. They've got quite a few fun options if you do go for the painted sides. They've got a painting rate table where the basic ones are a bit cheaper than the more expensive ones. There's Desert Worlds, Shrine Worlds and Martian Worlds. And fancy ones with World War Worlds, Royal Worlds or Forsaken Worlds. There's also a few other offerings and expansions, things like roof expansions and base expansions if you want a few more plastic bits. The pieces are planned to ship out in April and they've got a big rate table. In theory they should have customs and things prepaid. And in any case, if you wanted to check out their offering, there'll be links down in the video description, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. In any case, let me know your thoughts for what you want to see for model releases and Krieg previews down in the comments. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this, and feel free to check out the other links in the video description, such as the channel's Patreon and discount retailers if you want to support the channel there. In any case though, an absolutely massive thank you for listening. I'm sure I'll be back with more videos shortly, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.